Welcome to 50/50 Books, the book review podcast where the books are split in two, and figuring out just what is going on is always a toss-up. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Jonathan. This episode we're finishing up How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin. With this one, Taylor, we have another one where I can say you were right and I was wrong.
To be fair, I was
the major one.
Surface level right. Right. I had the person, kind of, but like I hadn't put all the clues together. And I will say I didn't put all the clues together until they were given to me. There's a lot going on.
Totally. I think this is one that it would have been difficult to fully get it ahead of time. And we'll get into it of what was surprising. Like the Joe thing was surprising to me. But yeah, like just all the behind the scenes details, they all made sense. I don't think anything felt too out of left field as far as just logic. But yeah, it was surprising information.
Yeah.
But we can go ahead and get right into it.
So the last part of the past we've heard about is when Frances Ford and Emily all get in that car together. Frances has just fired a shot off. Everybody knows Emily's pregnant. Who knows what's going to happen? I was like, is this when Emily disappears? It's not. She has the great plan to have... she goes to Frances with this plan. And it sounds great, which is, how you know you're getting manipulated, basically. And the idea is to have Peter and Tansy, Frances's family, take the baby because they've been wanting a baby for a long time. And Ford can help Emily by letting her stay somewhere else, or just basically get her out of the town, because if her mom finds out, it's going to be big trouble. Emily has planned all of this out, and it does show you like how not devious she is, but just like clever, I guess. It's a very clever plan, even if it is kind of manipulative, I guess, is a fine way to put it.
Yeah, as I'm looking back at scenes like this, and I think this will come up a lot throughout this discussion, I'm kind of reevaluating what I thought about Emily versus what we end up with at the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And that's just to say, like, I do think we have enough evidence from the first half of the story to say that one should be suspicious of Emily's actions and thoughts when it comes to this stuff. But I know she was portrayed as having a very specific intention, and in some ways she ends up being vindicated for those, right? Like where she wasn't actually doing that, or we don't know she was doing that. And so with this one, I'm kind of wondering like how much of this was actually her like trying to trap Rutherford in this situation. Like after a certain point, I think when she did like this sleeping with him and John, like that was definitely the intention. But I wonder if at this point where she's like, oh shit, I'm actually pregnant, like I actually have to do something about this, is her just covering herself versus trying to trap Ford.
Yeah, I will say, finishing the book, I definitely felt more favorably towards her, which is probably strange to say. I do think she was planning to trap Ford until she got the money, basically. Like, I think it was always a possibility that she was hoping might happen while she was pregnant. But it was probably very clear to see Ford was not interested and was only interested in Frances. And so she kind of was just like, if I try to do this, if I push too hard, I'm going to end up alone with a baby. So she kind of just took the best option she could, which was Peter giving her the money for Laura. But I think until like that moment, she was still hesitating enough about giving up Laura that like it was still a plan she was having. And it is said by others, so I guess we don't know entirely that she was, it's also I think was said by Saxon, which means we cannot trust it at all, that she was trying to like manipulate Ford and like get with Ford again. And it's like, I don't know how much that is the case. I would believe it because I do think she had a good plan in that, not that it's a good idea to trap somebody with a baby, but like
but a potentially effective plan. Yeah.
Yes, she was very clever in how she set everything up.
Yeah, part of what makes me believe it more than just having heard it from Saxon is that Frances is willing to believe it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can see that.
And I will say, the reasons why I think more favorably about her is I do really think she was just stuck in a terrible spot. I mean, we did bring up, I think, her mom being a piece of garbage. And it's like, you are just trying to place yourself in a safe position at that point, right? Because your family, you cannot rely on them. you are a woman in this time period, which means you probably could get a job, but it's not like you're going to really be able to exist on your own that well. Especially if you don't have like any skills. And Emily is always chalked up to being a beautiful face, but that's like all she is, right?
Right.
And she's kind of put in that box by her family and by even her friend group. So it's like,
yeah,
there was just like nothing. It felt like there was nothing she could do, really. Especially when you're friends with people who seem so perfect. And of course, this isn't Frances's fault, but like it really does seem like Frances was the perfect person, right? Like she was able to attract Ford. She gets along with people and like great people like John, who is like an amazing person. It's just like she attracts good people, and then she also is a good person because she's also taking care of you, Emily, who is doing all of these cruel things. And it's like, just stop being such a saint. Like, it's so annoying. But I don't know. So I just felt for her a little bit. Don't do what she did, but you know.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like, I have a lot more sympathy. And I already feel like I did have some sympathy just because of the mother situation, but just understanding, yeah, like the full situation, and just we'll get into later kind of the discussions of the way that Emily is portrayed by the community and such, but that's still what's happening in this book, right? We're still just getting very limited perspectives of who this person was, and like a lot of assumptions of what she was trying to do, and some probably are true and some are probably not. So that's why I'm like, I want to go through this kind of with a questioning eye of how much of what was implied about Emily is actually either verifiable or at least close to it, versus things that are more wishy-washy.
Right, for sure. And just with the way this book ends, the way Annie thinks about it all, I think it definitely matters a lot. But at least for this past section, that's kind of where we're at with like Chelsea House. That's where Emily's staying. Peter and Tansy are involved. Everybody in the friend group knows, right? Like, they are all in the know that they're going to just have this baby quietly, and then, who knows what's going to happen after that. But at the very least, she's being taken care of very well, and she is not yet murdered.
Right. Importantly.
Yeah, we're still not sure who did what when yet, for the most part.
Well, at some point we get the paternity test.
We do get a paternity test at some point.
Which I honestly didn't even think about, and maybe Emily didn't either.
Yeah. I mean, it is mentioned it was like new technology back then. So, I mean, her game would have been over anyway. So I guess like as soon as Ford mentioned doing that to her, she was like, I'm cooked. Like, there's nothing I can do here.
It's probably true. And it does totally change everything once they get that result, according to the conversation with John later on, right? So
yeah,
like I do think, because Ford ends up kind of pulling back and still lets her live at the house, presumably, and she has the housekeeper or whoever it was that he's kind of assigned to her. So in a way, he's still invested, but not invested personally.
Yeah, I for sure think the only reason he was invested was because of Frances. He does say, like, I'm only helping her because it's you asking. Like, he really doesn't care otherwise. But the past stuff we can basically leave at, there are a couple people in play that are still up for debate while we're reading through this book. It's multiple people are driving up to see Emily, who has at this point given up the baby. Peter has a weird line about taking care of it. It turns out it was just the money, but he wanted to be crazy anyway.
I hated that. That was the only one. I was like, why was this way?
Yeah, it does put it like, the way some of the files leave off basically is just to kind of keep people as suspects. So Peter is a suspect for like a chapter before it gets resolved. And you have like Walt, who's still very angry and is driving up to Chelsea to see Emily. And then you have Saxon saying him and Ford were at Chelsea or going to Chelsea or something. But, we can get into that. There's just people moving around and you can't trust any of it to be accurate.
Right.
So Annie is like going through 50 people, like it could be any of these people.
It just makes the elements of a good murder mystery, though, right? Like just enough information to grab onto, but nothing verifiable enough to run with.
Yeah, like we definitely just had to wait, is basically what was happening for the files to come through, because they did clear up a lot of nonsense, which we will clear up as we talk about the suspects, I think.
Yeah, so one character that I feel like is only really briefly thought of as a suspect was Archie Foyle. We find out pretty early in this half of the book that his suspicious trait might not actually be murder, but is instead growing illicit drugs on his farm, which ends up being a bit of a, what's the word? Tense point between him and Frances while she's still alive, and explains a bit of why he has such investment in the farm beyond just the fact that it's his farm. There's a very precarious thing happening there, and so whoever ends up in charge of this land might have an opinion about it, which ends up being true anyway. But that's the only real suspicious thing that ends up coming out of the Archie relationship, and Annie seems to be able to clear him kind of just on visiting the farm, which she does very forcibly, by the way.
Yeah, she is just snooping 100% through this farm. He's like, don't go in there. And she literally is like, bet. And he's just watching her from the window, like knowing she was going to do that anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think in the first part of this, we kind of were in agreement that like the Archie family as a whole, they didn't really have much of a reason to kill Frances. I guess the weed is like a slight, something might have got out of hand. It was a crime of passion type of situation, maybe, like, or tensions were just so high that somebody got murdered, which could happen. But yeah, within the whole aspect of this book, like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter much to the Emily Sparrow part of this. So
yeah, in a way, illicit drugs have a lot to do with the murder in the second murder in this book, just not in this way.
Right.
So we have to consider Peter and Tansy as potential suspects, especially because Peter makes a suspicious comment about taking care of it. It turns out, of course, that this one was not it either. Later on, we find out that this had to do instead with a money situation. This one I actually understood a little bit less clearly. I don't know if you want to continue on, Taylor.
Yeah, so basically, even Frances, I think, for a little bit of time, thinks it could be Peter and Tansy. Actually, for a while, she might have thought that because they were on the murder board. From my understanding, Emily's body in one of the coat pockets, there was cash still there, which means whatever money Emily had gotten from Peter was still with her when she was killed. So those two events must have happened very quickly together.
Right.
I guess it's also the point of, like, why would Peter leave the money with Emily if he was going to kill her? So, like, he did give her the money, and then he probably left, and then somebody else must have shown up and killed her at the Chelsea house.
Right.
So, yeah, they get cleared of everything going on, which is good, because they're dead, so, you know.
Yeah, wouldn't be super helpful.
Right.
Yeah, this really is the only one that I just was like having Peter say, "Oh, I took care of it," and be the end of a chapter really was like the cheap one for me. I think every other, suspicious thing that gets cleared felt fine to me in this book. This was the only one where I was like, it feels overdone.
Especially because it was immediately resolved right after. Like, I think Crane comes back with information right after that or something. Dude, I'm losing it. But
there's a lot to track.
Yeah.
I feel like my brain's a little muddled on this one too.
Yeah. So it's weird that, like, Peter couldn't just be like, I took care of it, like, I gave her money. Like, and that we couldn't get all of it at once. But, I'll give it to the author. She wanted to have some fun.
Yeah. It's okay. She's allowed to do it. Like, she can do that if she wants. So I think I'd be much more upset if everyone felt like that, right? So
right, for sure. Like, it's, like you said, it's like the only instance really where this happens. Everything else is pretty not cut off for no reason. Like, everything feels very fluid until, like, this one bit.
Yeah.
But our kind of main suspect, I would say, at this point is Walt. We kind of ride that line for a while. Basically to the end.
I had fun with it.
Yeah.
I had fun thinking it was Walt for a while. Because I definitely did. This is a case where I was like, oh, I kind of do think it is Walt. Like, I was definitely with Annie. Yeah,
we weren't sure in the first part because, as we mentioned, like, very trusted friends taking care of the will. Like, it seemed strange that it would be him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my biggest concern.
Yeah, also the fact that he was violent in the past. He was exceedingly angry with Emily, and he was supposedly going to drive up to Chelsea House to confront her. Like, things were lining up. And then we also get the Saxon information that Walt had been stealing money from Frances. although he makes it seem like it was happening over a long period of time, he really apparently was just doing this starting from when the body showed up. So not really that long.
Yeah. He really made himself sound more suspicious in this case.
Yeah, I was like, why is he making a big deal out of this? Like,
yeah. Especially now knowing, yeah, you're totally right. Like, there was no reason to make it sound as shady as it sounded.
Right. And then obviously, like, he in the past calls Emily a whore and a liar. And then we see that threat, which has that line again, like a whore and a liar. Not towards Emily, supposedly. We'll get there. But, like, just saying, you're a whore and a liar. So it's like that repetition is like maybe he was the one giving the threats to Emily. We'll clear that up. But basically, there was a lot going against this man.
Mm-hmm.
And I believed it.
Me too.
I didn't 100%. I was still slightly unsure because I feel like whenever a main character, like detective, is like, this is the guy, and there's still enough pages left, it's like, oh, there's like a twist coming. So I wasn't entirely sure, but it was between like Walt and Saxon in my head. Like something weird was going on with those two. I wasn't thinking about anybody else.
The thing that made me especially suspicious, beyond the fact that he was like executing the will and running this sort of competition, was the fact that he's doing that because Francis trusted him to. And I think it would be really shocking if at this point in time Francis hadn't figured out it was Walt, or at least hadn't cleared him enough to trust him with this.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think I put in my notes, like, I don't believe that Francis would be so blind to Walt taking advantage of her, right? Quote unquote, taking advantage of her, right? With the money and stuff. Like, I don't know. Like, Francis was so hyper detailed about everything that I could not buy it. I almost had a thought of, like, she's keeping her enemy close.
Yeah. I briefly thought that about Ford.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
I was like, my God, are they together just so that way she keeps him close? But
yeah. But yeah, I was willing to believe that about Francis, but I don't know. It really seemed like Walt for a time there.
Mm-hmm.
But also Saxon was like playing into it so hard. I was like, can't trust a man. Can't trust a man. Can't trust a man, but also can't trust any word he says.
Yeah, totally. I mean, his whole thing really is just breaking down any sense of reality, which is scary. So it's not worth playing with. I thought, yeah. Well, I guess we'll talk about that later. I just thought the fact that Annie plays a game with him was very risky.
Yeah, for sure. So we're kind of riding with Walt for a while, but we're still up in the air about who it might be. Jenny comes into play again just to kind of help things along, which I actually really liked. I like that Annie was able to kind of talk through everything going on.
I didn't really like it the first time it happened in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was like, is this really it for Jenny? Like, it's just like a way to get her to say stuff. But no, it was a better version of Detective sits by candlelight and writes notes. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, let's get this in a conversation with someone who could maybe add some flair to it, like be a little bit funny, but also have some different opinions sometimes and like challenge the opinions that we are all coming in with because we've been with Annie the whole time. I thought that was good.
Right, for sure. And Jenny is truly like unbiased, right? Like she has no connection to anything going on. So she's able to really to help Annie kind of focus in on like in like an objective sense. Where are people placed in regards to motive? Like what is happening? Like why might somebody kill Frances? Like, and especially in the way that they killed her. So it was like the candlelight. It was kind of like rubber duck coating and like I don't know.
Yeah.
Also
absolutely.
the way and just like I think it's good for author, like as somebody who writes, it's just good to be able to talk things out verbally. It just helps the words make sense. I don't know.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. One thing I didn't mention last episode, in case I felt different about it, and I did, was I felt in the first half of the book there were an awful lot of references to writing novels because I guess that's what Annie does, and that felt very author insert. Not to like, it wasn't obnoxious, but I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna want this to keep going through the whole book. We're gonna keep talking about if I wrote a novel, if I were gonna be making a mystery about this, like all of these references, which I guess pay off in the end because she writes a novel or whatever afterwards. But like that stuff I felt like didn't land for me in the first half. By the second half, I did feel better about it because it was kind of that, right? Like it's the point is being made that we like there needs to be these kind of pauses, reflections. Like these are the moments where we're talking things out, like reflecting on how these things actually play out. It didn't feel so kitschy to me in the second half.
Because there are two mysteries going on. So we need kind of, yeah, like you said, that reflection time. Not just to work through the mystery, but just to work through her as like a character and how she works.
Yeah.
Of course, they kind of sum up that there's a couple people that are questionable. Saxon, questionable. Walt seems guilty as hell. Cranes are probably fine, even though one of them is exceedingly hot. We can still kind of give them a pass, maybe.
Oh my goodness.
But the issue with this kind of sorting people in boxes is that I don't think a single goddamn one ends up being the killer. I'm probably forgetting everybody they mentioned, but at the very least, it's not too long after that Walt is kind of ticked off of Annie's list, because we get to thinking about the will, right? And Annie asks Crane if he was invited to the reading of the will, and he says no. So Annie is thinking that this wasn't going to be the mystery moment in which the killer is unmasked and like arrested on the spot. So, because if it was, she would have invited Crane to be there. Because while she had her issues with Crane, she did seem to respect the law quite a lot, and she did call Crane for literally everything. Everything.
Right.
So there's no way he wouldn't have been there if that was Francis's intent, right? So Walt can't be guilty.
No, and I'm glad you brought this up, because it was interesting logic. I guess to me, like, when I read this, it was like, oh, we actually already had enough information to know it wasn't Walt, which was the stuff I think kind of in the back of our minds throughout. But it was like kind of a clever observation. I would never have thought to think about who was and wasn't invited to see if to see if the detectives were on the list, to see if it was solved already in that way. Like that part's crazy to me. There's a lot of layers to get there.
Yeah, and for sure, like, she didn't even need it, right? Because Annie at that point, I think, or around that point, does figure out through the files or the journal that Walt never made it to Chelsea anyway. Their car, like, broke down, right?
That's true, yeah.
So she knows it can't be Walt, and I kind of like that I guess, like, her logic is even if it wasn't Walt, Francis could still be Walt, so she has to figure out if that is possible or something, but yeah, the logic she follows to get here was super, super clever.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just shows, like, how observant she is, even about Francis, who she's never met, but, like, everybody in this community kind of as well. Like, she is picking things up.
Totally. I mean, she says towards the end of the book, too, like, she's kind of learned Francis. She feels like she knows her better as a result of just investigating. And I do think she gets in her head a bit throughout all of this, beyond the fact that she's reading her diary, but because she's also kind of behaving like her too by engaging in the investigation that she set up for her, really.
And I think other people are seeing that too. Like, Rose seems to not necessarily like Annie, but likes her a little bit more because she is like Francis, right? Like, she has the notebooks and like is kind of a bit too obsessive about this case and the Emily Sparrow case. But I don't know. Annie is not Francis's, is not part of her family, but there are mannerisms and things about her that are very Francis.
Yeah, it almost makes me think like Francis would have also been a good novel writer, you know, with the sort of ways that she thought about things.
Yeah, it's just like a shame that it feels like Francis didn't really do anything with her life. I say that very cruelly. She had files on everybody, but that's like, yeah, obsessing, right? She became absolutely obsessed with solving the Emily Sparrow thing, that she just didn't do anything else with her life. It's just sad.
Yeah, it's funny, especially given the way that Joe will talk about Rose at the end of the book. Like, there is like a lot of obsession happening in this book among this friend group. So I did think this was interesting, though, that Francis has this thought of, is the fortune that was written for me what is what is happening to Emily? Because that is something I was suspicious of in the first half. I was like, what if this was like Francis? This is when I thought Francis was more malicious, potentially. What if Francis like is saying this is for her, but it was really Emily's fortune? But in a way, I can kind of see why. But well, because I had that thought, I can see why one would think that this was actually happening to Emily.
Yeah, and I think even Annie kind of plays into this as well when she holds the queen in the form of money. She's like, am I getting Francis's fortune now? Like,
yeah, it becomes more of a curse then, right?
Yeah, and it also kind of takes away the mysticism of this. It's like, it's not that there was a fortune. It was that they believed it so much that it could apply really to any of them.
Yeah, it becomes a framework for seeing things.
Yeah, and it wasn't good for Frances to kind of focus on that framework. Because honestly, it might have also been the fortune that caused her and Emily to be less close together. Like, yeah, there was the betrayal, but did she cheat on Frances with John, like, before or after the fortune happened? Like, did Frances already think she was going to get betrayed by the bird before or after that had happened? Like, what
That's a
kind
good
of led
question,
up
yeah.
to that? Because that might have caused tension in their relationship. And then, yeah, Frances just becoming distant in general from everybody, it seemed like, because she was focused so hard on this fortune.
Yeah, part of me wants to like revisit that fortune and see what was what, but I think in a way the answer is multiple things for some of
Yeah,
those
I
phrases,
agree.
right? Especially with the betrayal of the bird thing. Sure, I mean Emily did what she did, and that's definitely a betrayal, and the whole sparrow thing. But there were definitely several more mentions of the bird around Rose towards the first half of this second half of the book.
Mm-hmm.
That make a lot more sense in hindsight, because what is really the betrayal here, right? Like, is it Emily's thing, or is it the fact that Rose murdered Emily and kind of took, I would say, took a big part of Frances's life over by doing so? I mean, I just think it's both of them, right? So,
Yeah, so it really is just like what you kind of feed into, and Frances just fed too much into it. And it was also easy, like an easy way to place guilt on herself for what happened. Like, if she believes she got a bad fortune and she gave it to Emily, then it just makes her feel worse and makes her more obsessed with figuring out what happened. She's just creating her own trap.
mm-hmm.
Murder aside, though, let's talk about a little bitch named Saxon.
Oh my goodness, the worst.
It's not necessarily so much that we need to talk about him as a possible murderer. He's not. He's kind of just annoying, I guess.
No, I truly think that's what it is. I think there's some suspicion placed upon him because he is kind of an oddball kid and
Mm-hmm.
can't really be trusted at all. But that's like it, right? Like it's just a personality thing. It's that the character is poor, but that's it.
Yeah, and while I think Annie doesn't like trust him, which is right move, I don't necessarily think at this point she thinks he did it. But like, yeah, he did something. Is
Yeah.
basically what we come down to here. He does like trash the library and gets super angry about Frances, apparently, like scratches out her face and shit. Tries to break into that locked drawer, which we mentioned in the first part, which was not Emily's missing day, as I had assumed. I guess that was too easy of a date to pick, to be honest. But it was way more complicated.
Yeah, I would have never got this.
Absolutely not. It was basically just wordage in the fortune, like one right, four back, one right, like weird stuff, like certain words in the fortune that ended up being the combination, which Annie figured out. Good for her.
Yeah, truly.
It did make sense though, like the idea of Frances focusing on the fortune and putting the combination where only if somebody cared about what she cared about would they be able to figure it out. Inside, we see information on Saxon and Magda selling drugs, in that Saxon is supplying the drugs and breaking into the vet clinic, apparently. And Magda is selling the drugs in the ambulance, which crazy shit.
And she's on call. That's nuts.
Yes.
She's so open about it. Like when that phone call happens, and Annie's like, "Is this the line where I can get chemical help?" And she's like, "You got it. What would you like?" And it's like, wow, you would have given yourself up so quickly.
Yeah, I guess it's like openly known for the most part, though, except for
Right.
like the doctor and the detective. Everybody
Right.
seems to just be like chill, crazy town,
Everyone
small
in
town
Castle
shit.
Null doing K. Yeah.
Right, right. So that's what Saxon's doing. Of course, he lies about the. Okay, well, let me back up. Annie goes to her room. Her room's trashed. Who could have done it? Out of her wardrobe comes Saxon, and he says, "Wasn't me." And okay, crazy maneuver. But we'll play along, I guess.
Yeah. This is just second nature for him. Just a compulsive liar.
Absolutely a compulsive liar. He says it wasn't him in the library, says it wasn't him in her room. He wants to work together because he's so generous. Basically.
I love the way that Annie talks about him and throughout all this too, of like, this tool bag thinks I'm a dumbass. Like, she's got him figured out.
Yeah, she understands the whole time that, like, this is a rich piece of shit who has committed crime and will be, like, basically disinherited. Like, he will not be able to, or even if he wins, he will not be able to win this game because there's, like, a rule that you can't be arrested or whatever it is. You can't be in jail. I don't remember the exact wordage.
I forget, too. Honestly, when they said it, I was like, oh, was that a rule?
Yeah. But it makes sense if Francis was looking into what Saxon was doing. And Saxon seems to understand that he got fucking played by Francis.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, if we work together, we can split it, the inheritance, and it'll all be great. We'll both win. And Annie's like, actually, I'll go along with it, but we'll see how I feel at the end of this. Which is really the best he's going to get, to be honest. So they have a conversation about Walt. It's Saxon who kind of pushes the Walt has been stealing from Francis. But of course, Saxon still has some other game he's playing, and Annie understands this.
Yeah, I was curious about this too, given the whole, like, if Saxon is arrested, he can't get the inheritance. Like, is his goal really just to knock out Annie, thinking that it's going to default to him? Because he still has to solve the thing, and I don't know if he's done that. Or he really thinks it's Walt, and for some reason thinks he has enough on him.
I don't know if he really thought it was Walt. I think he believed it was, like, because I think it's Crane that makes the point of, like, Saxon is always trying to deceive you. And I think, or maybe it's Walt that says that. Somebody says that. And I think that's true. Like, I think if whoever he might have believed in front of Annie was the murderer is probably not who he actually thought was the murderer.
That's a good point.
And I mean, Saxon also knows that Magda knows who had the iron that was used to kill Francis. So he has a lot more connection to that storyline. So he either could have blamed Magda, or he knew it was Joe because of their closeness.
Yeah, we'll probably end up talking about this again when we talk about Joe, because I have questions about that too.
Mm-hmm. But basically, yeah, so he is trying to knock Annie out of the race, is what we're going to understand from this, by setting up a deal between Annie and Magda so that Annie can steal the iron, or the box that the iron was in, and hopefully get fingerprints. It's not a good plan, to be clear.
I mean, like, Annie lays it all out. Like, why would the same box still be there? Like, the murder weapon would be long gone. Like, there's so many ways they could stop this from being effective, so why would we try? There's all these risks. There's so many things she lays out there, and Saxon's just like, no, it's all good.
Yeah, he's really like, don't be an idiot, Annie.
Right.
Is what he really says. And she's like, of course, I'm being an idiot.
Right.
Because it's easier to just go along with it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's easier to let him think he's winning at this moment, and then behind the scenes, Annie basically figures it out. I think she figures it out when, or at least starts to, when they're at that bar and she sees those girls all, like, sharing clothes or, like, talking about it, because it reminds her of what Emily and Francis used to do.
Right.
And I mean, we get told this through the photo album that apparently Rose was also in that group, which I think makes sense if the three of them were best friends. They were all exchanging clothes, right? Which kind of gives a hint of, like, if the note was with Francis but in her clothes, then it was probably meant for somebody else. Somebody else probably being Emily, who was wearing Francis's clothes.
Right.
So she's able to start connecting those dots. She compiles her information. She makes backup plans. And she is going to meet with Magda, kind of, is what Saxon thinks. But really, how does she let her... I think it's through the... Oh my god, I don't remember how this exactly happens, but somehow she gets the information to Magda that she solved the murder.
She asks...
Was it the doctor?
Who to gossip. Yeah, I think it might have been. Yeah, it was. It was Dr. Owusu, where she was like, could you please, like, spread this information that I've figured it out, so that way Magda will realize that.
Yeah, and Owusu's like, you're not doing anything dangerous, are you, Annie?
Right.
And he's like, no, of course not.
Which I thought was so funny, because I didn't think she was doing something dangerous, just as a casual reader. Like, I didn't understand what she was doing, so...
Yeah. So yeah, she sets that rumor in place, has Jenny on standby to call Crane at a certain time if something happens, which ends up not being great, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then has Beth deliver her notes and her bag to Walt, which is, in case something happens to her, he will know who killed Frances and who killed Emily Sparrow.
I thought that was pretty smart because it also helps set a timeline a little bit of like, oh, I did this before we even got involved with like this weird little scheme. So that way, like, I don't know, that way there can be some, no, I planned just in case things do go wrong and like people try to get Annie in trouble for something. She can be like, well, like, look at all this information I already had at this point. Like, you should take what I say with a little bit more seriousness, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And it does also show like who she absolutely trusts at this point, right? Like,
true.
Even if we're still not sure about Walt, she trusts him 100% if he's getting this bag. And then obviously Crane is trusted at this point as well.
Yeah.
So that's the plan. Still no clue exactly why she's doing the plan, but she seems quite convinced she needs to do it to not figure out who murdered Frances, but like get the proof she needs, which is really the problem here, right? Like it's fine to know who it is, you need to prove it.
Right.
And it's very difficult with a syringe that's been tossed out already, and there's nothing she can use, so why not use herself, right? Crazy maneuver, but
absolutely. So was it her intention this entire time for Joe to be the one who came? Because that was nuts to me. I was like, why is Joe here? I was like,
yeah.
I guess I didn't realize that Magda and Joe were really like that in on it together first, like as far as the business. And like, yeah, I don't know, just information tipping and stuff. Like, I don't really understand the relationship between Joe and Magda and like, I don't know, all that, you know, implication, but I was not expecting this to work out in this way.
Yeah, I was also surprised. But obviously, I think Annie did know it would be Joe because that's why she told Magda, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if Magda knew, and Magda probably does know it was Joe, if she knows that Annie knows and she's about to meet Annie, then she can tell Joe.
Right.
So yes, it was Joe. Crazy.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't have called that.
Right. The pieces do line up, though.
Yeah.
But why did he do it is the big question, yes? Because his mom was a little upset.
Basically.
And
effectively over her decision to murder someone, too.
Yeah.
And somehow that becomes a whole thing of, you know, Rose is all, like, upset because Frances figured out it was her, and now Rose is all, like, going nuts about it, and Joe is like, oh, my poor murderer mother is not doing emotionally well because she murdered someone. Why don't I do the same thing?
Yeah. And I definitely think there was also just animosity because Rose seemed so invested in Frances, like you said, the obsession thing. But Frances did not give that energy back. She didn't show up to, like, support Rose or, like, for her birthday or, like, any other event or, like, care about her at all.
Yeah, that was interesting because it did feel like there was like an absence of connection between Frances and Rose. That was kind of confirmed a little bit with Joe's speech at the end.
Yeah. The issue really is that Rose was absolutely obsessed with Frances.
Yeah. And I just hate it because it's like, oh man, Joe was like monitoring the behavior of full adults and deciding how to like manage them, right? Like deciding like, oh, like this will be better if I just kill one of these people, which is the same thing Rose did, but he's doing it for a group he's not actually really involved with. I understand it's his mother, but that's like, it feels extra to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's unhinged behavior, to be honest. It's also crazy how he did it. He gave her the flowers and the hemlock so that she would be afraid she had been poisoned. So Frances would call him to help her, because that's what she always did, right? And he took that time to then kill her. And I don't know, like Annie does talk about it, like playing into her fear, and like that must have just been like such a terrifying way to die, and by like your friend's son, right?
Right. He did it by using her trust, or right, like to come into her home and be like, I'm delivering you medicine, and then kill her.
Right. And Frances hadn't done anything to Rose yet. Like, was Frances planning to reveal what Rose had done?
I mean, I think so.
I would believe that too, based on the law. But maybe she had been wanting Rose to say it herself, or because like there wasn't really proof.
There's gotta be a reason
right?
She didn't say it right away, right?
Right,
like,
for sure.
Must be a reason she was like, I found out Rose killed Emily, and I went to Rose first. Especially given what we know, yeah, about like the police aspect of like the detectives and being, you know, calling them all the time. Totally.
Yeah. So I do think Frances cared about Rose as much as she was able to care about anybody with how obsessed she had become with the case and her own, like, death. But crazy. The pieces were there for Joe, I guess. There are things that make sense when you look back at them, I guess is a better way to
100%.
put it.
I think a real clever person could have solved this one, but it was not for me. I could not do it.
I had some pieces, I feel like. Like, I thought the car was important in the first part, and it was. I just, like, I don't know, my brain didn't put together that, like, Bill, as the driver, would also be Joe's father, which meant he knew about cars. Like, that is a leap for me to make as an outsider, but, like, it does make sense. And just, like, Bill in general, I just did not think about Bill enough. But he is dead, so I guess, you know, I wasn't thinking about him at all.
I knew that he was getting brought up for a reason. I was like, it doesn't feel like there's a good reason to bring this character up. I have a note that just has his name because I'm like, it's gotta matter. And I could never make the connection.
Yeah. But speaking of Bill, do we want to just talk about the death of Emily Sparrow?
Yeah.
We've mentioned a few times, Emily was obsessed with Francis. Francis was obsessed with Emily. Rose was obsessed, apparently, with Francis.
And no one is obsessed with Rose.
Poor girl.
I know.
Yeah, we do start seeing that obsession when Rose basically tries to push Ford and Francis together. I think because, like, that's the closest they'll probably get to being a family as, like, a whole. Like, within the same household, kind of.
That's interesting.
And Rose does, like, will wear the same lipstick and talks about, like, they both kiss at, like, the same time, so it'll be, like, twin kisses or whatever, however she describes it. Very strange.
It was funny when Francis was like, hey, this was supposed to be my moment. It's like, oh, this is silly goofy, but it's actually, no, that's, like, that's your future, well, that's the person who murdered your friend. Like, it's not silly goofy.
And I think that kind of anger, I guess, like, light anger or, like, annoyance towards Rose is probably why Francis just was not close with Rose. Like, that's probably how Rose was their entire lives, living in Castle Knoll, right? Like, I don't know. Like, it was bothersome when it was Emily, but she didn't deserve to die for it. Like, at the very least, you can cut yourself off from somebody like that if they're, especially if you're not sure if you can trust her.
Yeah, they even say something of the sort earlier on where, like, they just wanted, in a way, they kind of wanted Emily to come back so they could just close things off, you know? Like, maybe they were just going to cut Emily off, but they didn't even get that choice.
Yeah, I think it ended up with, like, Frances just feeling very stuck in that time period because she wasn't able to resolve anything or make that choice, right? Like, towards Emily, and Emily was never able to make a choice again, so.
Yeah, there's just no closure.
Yeah. But Rose is so happy to move on. Yeah. I think she talks bad about Emily even after her death. Like, it's a good thing she's not in the picture anymore, that kind of stuff, I think is what Rose says. Which is, like, could be passed off. Like, people don't suddenly become good because they're dead. But it is a bit harsh, I think, about somebody you were friends with.
Yeah.
But yeah, Rose, through the files, just seems to get more unhinged, is what we get, really. And then in the present, she's still slightly unhinged. She, like, hates Laura for some reason, and to a lesser degree hates Annie because of, you know, they're Emily's, basically. So
yeah, I guess also just because Frances is obsessed with Laura's art. She assumed that Laura was the right daughter from the prophecy, so she was like, I have to look at the art. Like, whatever it is she talks about, makes, whatever, like, all could be clues. Whether or not Laura knows it could all be clues to help me find things, especially if Frances is leaning into the sort of mystical aspect, which I guess she is enough to believe it, so she might think something will appear. And Rose sees that as, you know, Frances is still obsessed with Emily. The whole point was of me getting rid of Emily was to be over it, you know?
Right. Especially if Laura looks like Emily, which seems to be a point, right?
Yeah.
So Laura just makes Rose feel stuck in the past, basically. As much as she wants to move forward, Frances and Laura just are not allowing it. Laura doesn't know, bless her heart, but, you know, there's not much she can do.
Also, my apologies to Laura for putting my bets on her being the murderer.
Really thought she was the murderer. She's just a distant gal.
Yeah, it's grabbing onto nothing.
But I think, like I mentioned before, Rose did seem to like Annie enough because of those ways she's similar to Frances that she's able to get the photo album, which does help put this thing together, to be honest. Because again, it's about the clothes. It is with the notes and like passing the notes between clothing, but also the fact that there's that coat, right, that Emily was killed in. And kind of just the question of like, how did she get it? Frances notes that she lost it, right?
Right.
She doesn't say Emily took it and never gave it back, but she shows up. Emily shows up in it. So it had to get to Emily somehow. Frances basically has to do like gardening for the neighbor to like make up for sneaking out at night. And there's an issue because Emily has gone to Chelsea apparently with these plans to trap Ford, and Walt is driving with John to go confront Emily, and Ford and Saxon might be there or going there, or their car is going there. There's a lot going on. It's a very high pressure environment.
Mm-hmm.
John goes to pick up Frances and is like, are you going to come with us to like confront this whole situation? And Frances is like, I can't, my mom is watching. So Rose is like, give me your clothes and I'll garden for you and she won't be able to tell and you can go. So because it's, high pressure, Frances just kind of gives Rose a bunch of winter clothes and is like, deal with this. And Rose is like, I'll just give them back to you later. It's fine. And that was that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of also when we get the Peter line that's weird, and we're still not sure if Ford and Saxon are at Chelsea or not because Saxon is a little bitch. Walt's car breaks down, but, we learn that later, and there's a lot of mysterious things happening. We're not sure. But the winter clothes is important, and Annie realizes they are important because it's entirely possible that Rose had that coat, and, that's how it got to Emily. And then I guess the question is, how does Rose get to Chelsea? But there is a line in the files, which is like, Rose is talking about her new boyfriend, which is Bill, who's the driver, and how nice it is because she just has to ask and Bill will drive her anywhere, right? And they get to drive in this cool car, and it's great. I'm like, good for you, Rose. You found a man. I'm happy. But it turns out the car that was going to Chelsea did not have Ford and Saxon in it because Saxon is a fucking liar.
Right.
It actually had Bill and Rose in it.
Thinking about the Bill aspect of this, they kind of debate whether or not they think Bill knew what was going on. And it's kind of crazy to think of Bill driving her up there and her being like, I'll be back in a minute. And like him sitting in the car or something. And she just casually murders Emily, puts her in a trunk and comes back out.
I do agree that he didn't have anything to do with it. I think that does make sense. I think he figured it out.
Yeah.
Like, he at least suspected. But yeah, he probably just didn't confront it. He must have loved her enough that he didn't
You
talk
didn't want
about
to know,
it.
honestly, yeah. Because I thought about that when I briefly thought Ford might have been the one who did that. I kind of asked that question about Frances of like, well, how could Frances possibly like live with Ford and like, ignore the fact that he might have disappeared Emily, which was good reason to understand that Frances didn't believe he did it. But like now that same question is here of like, I don't know anything about Bill really, but it's crazy to think that he might know Rose did this and is just kind of living his life the whole time with her.
Yeah, it might be it might just be enough to be like, he doesn't have proof, he can't prove it, so he's not going to think about it, right? Like, maybe Emily did just leave. Maybe she did just disappear herself and went to a show or whatever Rose said, right? Like, let's believe that because it's happier to believe that, basically.
Denial.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think Rose existed in denial. Like, even at the very end when her and Annie talk, there's the note of Rose like taking what Annie is saying and twisting it into a story that's better for herself.
That's true. Yeah. I guess the way that this final part of the figuring out who's who did what, it's interesting because you kind of, I guess you can figure out that Joe is the suspect without this in a way. I think there's enough information to figure out that Joe killed Frances without this, but this really informs so much of it. And like, I understand why they had to get so invested in Emily's story, because really it is what informs everything that happens afterwards. It triggers Frances's obsession depth with Emily afterwards, and sort of the relationship she and Rose have, I think, is long-term affected by it, right? And like Rose kind of remains unhappy because she did it and didn't get the results she wanted. So there's so much that comes down to that old story.
Yeah. And I think there is like something Annie also mentions at the very end. It's like, it's also important because it's important. Like, this is a woman that was killed when she was, 17, 18? Like, yes, it was important to Frances to a probably detrimental amount. Like, Frances really, I don't want to say she ruined her life. She did seem to love Ford, I think. But there's probably so many things she didn't do because she was so focused on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we ignored that part of it, just the solving of both of these cases, like, it mattered, right? Because, like, Laura deserves to know who her birth mother is.
Yeah, totally.
And Annie deserves to know she still has a grandfather, right? And Laura still has a father, and they can kindle that relationship. And, like, this girl who really was in a tough spot and, like, did some things that weren't the best, right? But really just seemed like a victim in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah.
And she, if we can jump for a minute, like,
Mm-hmm.
Frances does talk about this, like the way people are allowed to change after the fact, but Emily is always going to stay the same because she has not been given this chance to change. Like, Rose can say as much as she wants, Emily was a bad person. Like, she wasn't going to change. She was going to ruin our lives. Like, whatever, however you want to justify what you did, that's not my business. But could Emily have become a better person? Could she have it? Could she even have been a possible mom? Maybe not to Laura, but to somebody else. Sure, right? Like, there's just infinite possibility in what she could have done with her life, good and bad, and she will never get that opportunity because she was killed. Like,
Yeah.
It's just like it is just unfair.
Yeah, and I think there are some apt observations in the book about that comparison with Walt and John, who both do some, I would say, pretty bad things in the book. Right? Walt physically harms Emily, and John is involved with this whole cheating thing and really emotionally harms Frances. And they get the chance to become a lawyer and a clergy person, right? Which are so different than how one might envision those other versions of themselves. They get to grow. They get to have positive stories. Basically, no one knows about either of those things outside of the friend group, but everyone knows about Emily, right? She was a story. And so she's being painted kind of in the local media in a certain way, but definitely in the town gossip to be a certain type of person that no one actually knows for sure she would have ended up like, you know? Like yeah, exactly. It's like Rose got to choose when Emily was at her low that was the time to immortalize her. So and that wasn't up to Emily. The other part of that is that Walt and John are men and Emily is not. And like Walt can have, behaved as an abuser, but no one will ever actually keep his life down for that. But then Emily gets killed for what she did. Like, I understand there was manipulation and kind of emotional aspects, but Walt gets off clean, right? And in a sense, John does too, because Frances and John end up lifelong friends still. And I mean, I'm happy that they were able to get past what happened, but he made a really bad decision too, right? And like, it was upsetting to read about it when it's not only does Emily like proposition John, but she's like, oh, and also we don't need a condom. He's like, yeah, okay, like being a stupid teenager. And he pretty much gets off clean for that too. And he has to deal with some sort of emotional repercussion, his own emotional consequences for it, but it doesn't actually affect his ability to be a successful adult. So Emily is being unfairly punished, basically as a woman for doing things that I don't want to say are worse or better than these other guys, but definitely like these other guys deserve some sort of punishment of their own.
Yeah, for sure. And it can be kind of expanded, not necessarily in the death part, but that idea of being stuck in that one thing, right? That does happen a lot in this type of discussion as well. Like, men get to do whatever they want. They get to have whatever body count they want. They get to do something bad. And as long as they apologize and seem like they get better, then it's fine, right? We brush those things off, right? But if a woman does something bad, that is not even just bad. Like, if a woman does something bad, or if she's a victim of something bad, that will stick with her forever. She will never be able to leave that. That is how people will see her. They get encapsulated in this one idea of what they are. Mm-hmm. So it's like Emily dying is also just symbolic of like how people would have viewed her entire life, right?
That's a good point.
Like, she was always going to be the slut. She was always going to be, like, hateful. Like, she was always going to be these negatives the town thought about her, whether she lived or not. Like, as long as she was around, or even not around, if she had just disappeared, actually disappeared, she would have still become this story, right? And it's just, ugh.
This is also, to contextualize too, the behavior she has, while not excusable per se, it was informed, contextualized by the pressure she was receiving as a woman from her mother, right? Like, there's a whole other aspect of this, of the pressure she was experiencing and the decisions she felt she had to make as a woman in her time, because she was told, like, kind of all she was good for was being beautiful, right? Like, that's a whole other thing behind this too, that men aren't having to experience typically. So
Right. Even her, like, secretary position, which was a lie, but if she still did it, like, in her mother's eyes, you just do it until you find a businessman husband, and then you stop working. Like, that is the idea she's working with here. So she played the best game she could.
right.
Basically, with the hand she was dealt.
But yeah, otherwise she's just being punished for being a woman in many ways.
Yeah, and I think Frances understood this, and I think Annie also, at the end, having a funeral kind of for both of them, understood this as well.
Yeah. And it's funny too, you mentioned the thing about Rose maybe wanting to feel like family with Frances, because at the end of the day, Frances and Emily did kind of end up family. Like, their families are intertwined.
Yeah, and I think Annie kind of perpetuates that by, I mean, basically becoming a gravestown, right, through the will, and also in the library, just hanging pictures of all of them, right? Emily pregnant with Laura, and just, making sure they stay a family and, like, connected. It's just very nice.
I have to say, with the John part, like, so like I said, I was pretty upset reading what he had done, and I feel like in a way he does get a lot of excusing, especially with Annie kind of being like, oh, like, you can be my, my bud now, like, connecting with her grandfather, even though she doesn't want to say it that way yet. So it was like, I was kind of like, I really didn't like John, but I mean, it was nice to see that kind of coming together scene at the end. I just wish it was, like, more complex than that, I suppose.
Oh, interesting. I actually liked John a lot. I think it's because I understand he did make a mistake, right? But I do think he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it. And I think he punished himself for it as well. Like, the understanding between him and Frances that they still loved each other a great deal, but they could not be together, right? And I think John knew that because he had betrayed her. And he wasn't able to forgive himself for that. And I think that's why he let go of Laura as well. I mean, he didn't really get a say, right? Like, it's Emily's baby.
That one was kind of sad.
But yeah, he doesn't bring it up. He doesn't ruin this protective bubble around Laura and, like, her upbringing. He lets that go, right? He doesn't put up a fuss about it. And I think that is because he's kind of, like, blaming himself for what he did, which is good. But, like, it was a mistake, right? It was a mistake when you were a kid. 17, it's not really a kid, but, like, close enough. Like, you do dumb shit. I don't think this is the worst thing somebody could ever do. It seems like he tried to make up for it through his entire life. We don't know that. I don't know how good of a clergyman he is, but, like, just, like, his elation at the idea of getting to know Laura and getting to know Annie just made me think very positively about his character.
I can see that angle for sure. I don't think I would be able to carry on an extended dislike of John. I think it's really what's coming out here is just my discomfort with how close that story is to Emily is the problem and John isn't.
Right. Yeah.
So, and in a sense that makes me glad that he like takes credit for it in some way and, like, keeps that in mind throughout his life of, like, at least a way he it's something he wants to make up for and a way, a reason for improving himself, right? But yeah, it's just an upsetting thing to read, I guess, is all. It was sad, though, on the other hand, right, to see Hugh couldn't really be involved with Laura's life, and to see him kind of have this parasocial relationship because Frances would, like, report back, but he couldn't really be involved at all. So, it's just unfortunate because in a way he, and again, I don't want it to feel like it's just Emily's fault here, but, like, in a way he was used and he has to deal with that part of it too. He was used and he doesn't get to, like, have a say in what happens next as a result. So it's just, the whole thing is depressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a series, so hopefully we get more of him. I'm sure we will.
Yeah, I would definitely be down to read a sequel.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the last things we get is Annie visits Rose for one last chat. And at least my take on it was that it felt kind of fruitless. Like Rose doesn't give a lot back other than like that, that one thing of Rose coming up with her own version of what Annie was saying. So it kind of left me wondering what the point of that interaction was.
Yeah, I think it was meant to be fruitless. Like, I think Annie went there for closure and like hoping to feel like she had reached the end, right, of this situation. But kind of the hint of the theme we get throughout this book and something Annie brings up during this conversation is that like the past doesn't really stay buried. Things don't really end. And like the hurts you feel in the past, they carry on, right? And so just because Rose was caught, just because Joe was caught, doesn't mean any of this is over. Just because like the case was solved, the file might have been shut. It doesn't mean you've reached the end. Like Annie will still be upset about what happened. The fact that she never could meet Francis and what happened to her grandmother, like all of that will still exist within her. And it'll still exist in Rose, right? Like we're always going to be a little bit obsessed about those things as long as we don't do it to an extreme amount. But I don't know. I just felt like thematically, like Annie wanted it to be over, but there's also the understanding that like it's never over, right? Like she will probably have nightmares about what Joe did to her for the rest of her life.
Right.
And I hope that, as morbid as it sounds, I hope that is brought up in future books of like how traumatic it is, right? And how upset she is and filled with grief she is about the things she missed out on and what almost happened to her and like all of those types of things. Like, I don't know. Like, end of mystery, end of book. You want the end. You don't get it. That's how it goes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and maybe that'll inform a bit of future behavior from her, right? We see Frances kind of obsess about Emily for her whole life. Maybe this will kind of trigger something similar in Annie, where she kind of gets involved in these things because of how unclosed of a feeling she has from this.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting starting off point. The idea of this feeling and like how it might affect her mentally going on and with more cases she solves. It would be interesting to see.
I agree.
I guess ratings?
Let's do some ratings.
Simple, to the point. I had a lot of fun. I loved being here. Chapter 36, I think it was, with John and Annie talking, fucked me up. So I'm going to give it a 5.
Oh boy.
I know, crazy.
I also had a great time reading this book. Really, like my only criticism of it is that one cheap feeling thing with Peter, and that's kind of it. It's really right. The other thing I'll say, just to contextualize the score, is I do feel like I could have been wowed more on the other end, right? Like I do think this was a really good book. I think if we're talking about like the difference between a 4 and a 5, like that's what I would look for, is like, whoa, like totally like mind blown. And I think just like mysteries do have the capability to get me a little bit more shocked than this one did. I think this one really like towed the line really well though, right? Like it didn't shock me in a way where I was like, well, I could have never solved that. It's like, no, I'm just like, I didn't put enough energy or like cleverness into it to solve it. So anyway, I was teetering back and forth between 4 and 5 because of that, but I think I'm gonna go with 4. And again, it is a really good book. I don't want it to seem like I'm like trying to demote it, because it was really fun, and I would totally recommend it to other people for sure. I think there was just some room above it for it to hit me harder. And then I think we're going to end this one with a rosebud thorn.
All right, so for my rosebud thorn, I'm going to do my thorn first because I think my rose and my bud kind of go together.
Okay.
But the thorn actually was very hard for me to think of a thorn, to be fair. I think the only thing about this book, which will probably get better in later books, is Laura. Just how how emotionally distant she was. And like I understand that as a character, like I'm going to assume she had a crazy upbringing, and it seems like her last partner, like Annie's dad, was a piece of shit. So, like, she had a lot going on. Understandable. But the idea of her and Annie at the Gravesdown estate, and she's like, okay, I got to get out of here, after her daughter just almost got murdered, I was like, okay, we're that distant. Like,
Yeah.
it felt like a lot. I'm still not sure about her character, right? Like, I don't know. I just feel like she could have been more concerned for what was going on. And there is a lot Annie isn't telling her, but the fact that Annie feels like she can't tell her or doesn't want to, like, distract her mom feels like a problem. But, you know, we'll see what happens in later books. That was really the only thing.
I get that.
My rose, nobody will be surprised, was Crane, Detective Crane. It's not often I like men. Sometimes, like, I feel like it makes sense in this kind of book that you would have a character like Crane, right? Which is, like, fine. Like, I am a romantic, but my issue with reading romances is a lot of the times it's so, like, physically focused, and relationships seem to just, like, take advantage of, like, physical attraction, and it feels like there's no substance, right? I think with Crane, we understand he's probably very attractive. I feel like Jenny brings it up more than anybody. But really what I felt when I read Crane and Annie together is, like, they could also just be good friends. Like, good friends who banter and who maybe get involved in the same cases and, like, want to take care of each other. It could be platonic and I would still love it, right? And that's, like, me being asexual, that's kind of how I want relationships to be. And just, like, the foundation for what this relationship could be and, like, how they interact together, I just felt great about it.
Yeah.
I had a good time. And I also like that Crane trusted Annie's, like, opinion, right? He was, like, willing to answer questions. He was, like, taking her seriously. When she called and was like, were you in the will? And, like, I need to talk about this. He was like, makes sense to me. I'll answer, you know, whatever I can to help. Because I think he did actually want to help her to figure it out, right? Because it's not like he wants to really solve this and have the property go to Oliver and his company, right? So their relationship was just really great. I loved them. And then, of course, my bud is kind of connected to that Crane thing. I guess my Crane thing could also be a bud. Another bud, though, would be Annie and John, which we've kind of talked about already. Just, like, their ability, I guess Laura is included in this as well, but, like, their ability to kind of create their family. And I've probably said this in past episodes, but blood doesn't necessarily mean you'll be family, but I think John clearly wants to connect with Annie and with Laura. He's never gotten to. He's never let himself. So, like, them having this chance and Annie's kind of not taking over, but, like, helping John kind of grieve Francis by, like, staying with him and supporting him, I think is really lovely. And I don't know. I'm also just excited to see the development of that relationship and how they might become a family, because that's a very complicated situation. Doesn't happen overnight, but it'll be interesting, I think.
What's interesting about that is I feel like for Annie, Jenny is kind of her voice of reason, right? I feel like for Francis it was John. And so I kind of wonder if he's going to try to fill that same niche in future books with Annie. Like, because at least Jenny, while she's the voice of reason, she's, like, a little more, like, hip into it and, like, willing to get invested. Like, I wonder if John will serve as an even more separated, kind of grounded type for, like, her future adventures, or maybe more for her personal life instead of detective work, something like that. Because that seems to be the role he serves.
Yeah, I could see it for, like, personal or, like, emotional support, maybe. Because, like, I think Jenny is good at that, at, like, keeping Annie grounded, but it depends. I don't know if Jenny's going to be in every book, right? Like, if she's still living in London, I don't know how around she'll be.
Yeah, true.
And it'll also be a good way for Annie to connect more with Francis as well. Because I do think there was a part of Annie that really wanted to know who Francis was. And she won't really get to do that, but she can know about Francis not just in, like, the 1960s, but as she grew in Castle Knoll because of Francis and John still having their relationship.
Yeah. I'll say my rose, it was, we talked about this for a while, but just adding complexity to the murder kind of Emily, right? To say that this whole thing of her life was cut short and she didn't get to kind of carve her full path. I don't see that angle of discussion around murder happen a whole lot, like whether in books or outside, like to think of like that person as a person who can potentially change or grow, or maybe not, but like like giving someone the opportunity to make that choice for themselves. I don't know. I just thought that was such a unique and kind of enlightening perspective to be in what is otherwise supposed to be a cozy mystery. So I was really happy with that. Like that is one of the more thought-provoking things I think this book had, and I thought it was super cool.
For sure. I agree.
The Thorn, I was unsure if I should just bring up the Peter thing again, but actually I think the Thorn is Saxon, and not because I think he was written poorly, but just because he was kind of annoying.
Yeah.
Like good job to the author for writing this character. I did not like him as a person is the reason for the Thorn. Like reading about him was annoying. Like the whole getting involved with him was real sketch to me as far as those last few scenes. He was just kind of weird, you know? Like I don't know. It was bad vibes is all.
And you kind of want to feel bad for him a little bit when he's a kid, but like at this point he's an adult and it's like he's still unhinged and like causing chaos for the sake of chaos and really cares more about himself and his inheritance than the fact that like Francis was murdered.
Yeah.
And also
100%.
Emily was murdered. Like, I don't know.
And let's go ahead and just lump Elva in with this too, because good for him. He found his perfect partner, because I can't stand her either.
Yeah, Elva sucked. Thankfully she didn't come up like at all.
Yeah, honestly.
To be honest. But yeah, she was awful.
For Bud, they already confirmed that she's staying in Castle Knoll. Otherwise, like that would have been mine, because I'm like, oh, like I love the way she's integrated into this community. I guess I suppose she like actually makes a friend group while she's there. You know, like I hope to see like the development of either like whether it's Oliver or Crane or whoever else we don't know that's in town. Like I really want to see her like establish a community. Make herself a member of the community that isn't just the person who's related to Francis or like who is involved with the Francis thing.
Yeah. Yeah, because there is the potential of like her kind of being put on this pedestal almost. Like she solved 2 murders and stopped a drug ring and like did these things that are kind of great. And if she's living at Gravestown, she could be just as isolated as Francis was, just for a different reason. So yeah, it would be interesting to see her kind of integrate and also integrate with her own age range, right? Which is like Crane and Oliver and all of them. That would be, yeah.
Yeah, and it would stink if she ended up being an outsider because she's kind of this detective-y type, right? Like, if she's seen as a narc, right? Like, if people are like, I don't want to be close to her because she's going to expose my deepest, darkest secrets, that would be unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. But that was this book. Obviously, if you have your own thoughts and theories, the Twitter is 5050_books, and there's also the Goodreads, which all of that is in the description. If you don't want to use Twitter, understandable. But for next month, we are reading Beyond the Black Door by A.M. Strickland. Halfway is about up to, but not including, chapter 16, Impolite Intrusions. Because you're going to love this, John. This book has chapter numbers and chapter titles.
Amazing. Couldn't be better.
For you. Just for you. And let me actually tell you what the book is about, because we've gotten into the habit of just saying, it's kind of like this, and then we don't actually say any words of substance. But it is a YA queer fantasy. Seems like it's an asexual main character, which, right up my alley, love that shit. And it has Kamai and, like, her mom. They are soul walkers, apparently, whatever that is. So they can travel to people's souls while they sleep. But Kamai and any soul will see the same black door, and she's told never to enter it, even if it has like a weird pulse and she hears her name whispered through it. Whatever, don't enter that door. But obviously, she does, and it also says when tragedy strikes, she opens the door. So don't know what that's about, but you know, classic. So we're getting back into the fantasy. I'm not sure if it's like just like fantasy or just kind of fantasy. There was mention of like court intrigue, I think is what Goodreads said. So I'm like, I don't know how fantasy we're getting here. It might be quite fantasy.
It sounds like it on just on the description. It sounds, you know, it leans right into the Soulwalker thing, which is kind of its own, I don't know, kind of magical sounding structure, right? So I don't know. Off the bat, it does sound like it'll be like real fantasy. So I'll be curious because I'm not sure we've done one to this level.
Yeah, and there's apparently like a kingdom at risk, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it might be high fantasy. Or it might just be like a retextured United Kingdom. I'm not sure yet.
Right, yeah.
But
okay,
we'll see. But yeah,
I'm
I don't
excited.
think we've done anything like high fantasy.
Yeah.
So yeah, very exciting. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.